Somewhere in the forests of Belgium, in the final days of 1944, an American military policeman waved a jeep through his checkpoint without a second look. The men inside wore American uniforms. They spoke American English. They carried American papers. They were not American. They were German commandos, dressed and equipped to look exactly like the men they intended to deceive, and the vehicle carrying them past that checkpoint was not a German design at all. It was a jeep, captured from the very army it was now helping to infiltrate. Within days, that operation would leave one of the most senior generals in the Allied High Command locked inside his own headquarters, afraid to step outside. It would leave American soldiers interrogating each other at gunpoint over baseball trivia and state capitals. And it would confirm something German officers had already begun admitting to each other on battlefields from the Egyptian desert to the hedgerows of Normandy. The most valuable machine in the entire American arsenal was not a tank. It was not a bomber. It was a small, homely, four-wheel drive truck, designed in less than a week by a freelance engineer nobody in Detroit had ever heard of. This is the story of how the Jeep became the one piece of equipment that German generals, forced years later to explain their own defeat, could not stop talking about. In the late autumn of 1943, at a testing ground somewhere in the United States, American engineers got their hands on a small German staff car that had been captured in North Africa and shipped across the Atlantic for one purpose. They were going to take it apart and study it. It was painted in desert tan. It had a flat, smooth underbody, an air-cooled engine mounted in the rear, and a strange, sloping front that ended in a single curved fender. The bucket seats were comfortable. The construction was elegant. It had been designed by Ferdinand Porsche himself. It was a Volkswagen Type 82, a German Kugelwagen, the small four-wheeled staff car the Wehrmacht used to move officers across the desert and across the steppes of Russia. American engineers measured every component. They timed it on slopes. They ran it through sand pits and water crossings. They compared it, side by side, with the small, square, painfully simple four-wheel drive utility truck that American soldiers had taken to calling the Jeep. When the verdict was finally written down, it appeared in a War Department intelligence handbook published on the 15th of March 1945, called Technical Manual E30-451, the Handbook on German Military Forces. Its assessment of the Volkswagen was blunt. The German equivalent of the American Jeep, it concluded, was inferior in nearly every meaningful way, except in the comfort of its seating. That manual was restricted. Fewer than 1,000 copies circulated, and it was not handed to every Allied officer. But it was read by the men who needed to read it, and the verdict was clear. What that handbook could not fully capture was the strangest part of the rivalry between these two vehicles, the thing German soldiers in the field had already been demonstrating for almost 2 years. When German troops captured American Jeeps in the Egyptian desert, in Sicily, in Italy, in France, they did not destroy them. They did not abandon them. They fought to keep them. Wehrmacht units in North Africa repainted captured Jeeps with German crosses and pressed them into service so often that German vehicle inventories had to be amended to account for them. A vehicle that German propaganda had publicly mocked as a toy for an unserious nation was the same vehicle German officers in the field were quietly stealing whenever they could. To understand how a quarter-ton truck, designed in a matter of days by a freelance engineer working in a half-empty Pennsylvania drafting room, became one of the machines that Dwight Eisenhower himself would later call vital to the entire Allied victory, we have to go back nearly 100 years to a much older problem the United States Army had been quietly losing, and to a long, hot stretch of American countryside in the summer of 1939. The problem the Army had been losing was a problem with mud. In August of 1939, the United States First Army held a set of maneuvers around Plattsburgh, New York, described at the time as the largest peacetime military exercise in American history. Roughly 50,000 troops took part. There were mock attacks, simulated artillery barrages, and along every dirt road in the exercise area, long columns of horses and motorcycles, trying to do what the Army had been attempting since the 1860s, move men, orders, and light weapons across broken ground faster than an enemy could react. It was not working. Observers who walked the exercise grounds afterward described mile after mile of churned earth, wagon wheels sunk to the axle, and exhausted animals standing knee-deep in brown water with nowhere left to go. The horses were too slow and ate too much. The motorcycles fell over in the mud, broke their riders' legs, and could not climb a moderate hill with 2 men aboard. The Model T Ford the Army had used as a staff car since the First World War was a road vehicle. Take it off the road, into a plowed field, and it became a tractor without traction, its wheels spinning uselessly, while officers stood beside it, waiting for orders that could not reach the front in time. The man watching this with the most carefully concealed alarm was a 58-year-old officer named George Catlett Marshall, a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute, who would on the 1st of September 1939, the very day Germany invaded Poland, take the oath of office as the new Chief of Staff of the United States Army. Marshall had served in the muddy fields of France in 1918. He had seen what mud did to men and to messages. For years he had pushed against an indifferent Congress and an underfunded peacetime army for a small, fast, four-wheel drive scout vehicle that could go where horses could not and motorcycles dared not. He had been ignored. Now Poland was burning. France would burn next, and Marshall knew it. Whatever he was going to do about the Army's mobility problem, he would have to do it in a hurry. On the 11th of July, 1940, 2 weeks after France surrendered, the United States Army Quartermaster Corps sent specifications to 135 American automobile manufacturers. The terms were severe to the point of cruelty. The Army wanted a four-wheel drive vehicle with an empty weight no greater than 1,300 pounds, a payload of 660 pounds, a wheelbase of 75 inches, and an engine producing at least 85 foot-pounds of torque. It wanted a folding windshield, a speed range from 3 to 50 miles an hour, and a rear bench for 3 soldiers and a machine gun. Bids were due in 11 days. A working prototype was due in 49. Of the 135 companies that received the specifications, nearly all of them threw the document in the trash. The deadline was considered a joke. Only 2 responded to the original tender. One was Willys Overland Motors of Toledo, Ohio. The other was a small, nearly bankrupt company in Butler, Pennsylvania, called the American Bantam Car Company, which had been building tiny, European-style economy cars and was so close to financial collapse that its engineering staff had already been laid off. Ford joined the competition shortly afterward, when the Army invited them in. Bantam had no engineers. It had no money. It had 11 days to submit a complete bid with blueprints, cost calculations, and supplier lists, and 49 days from acceptance to deliver a finished, drivable, fully tested vehicle. What it did have was a telephone number for a freelance engineer in Detroit named Carl Probst. Probst was 56 years old, the son of a country doctor from Point Pleasant, West Virginia. He had been building automobiles in one form or another since the early years of the century, and at that moment he was between jobs and short on cash. The president of Bantam called him. Probst said no. Bantam pleaded. Probst still said no. Then a man named William Knudsen, recently recruited from the presidency of General Motors to take charge of Army procurement, intervened personally and told Probst that the country needed him. Probst got in his car and drove east on the 17th of July, 1940. By the time he walked into Bantam's nearly empty drafting room and rolled up his sleeves, he had less than a week to design a vehicle from scratch. He worked through Wednesday night. He worked through Thursday. By Friday afternoon, the 19th of July, he had completed the basic layout drawings for what would, within a year, be called the Jeep. He took Friday evening off to see a film. On Saturday and Sunday, he finalized the cost calculations and supplier specifications. On Monday morning, the 22nd of July, he and the Bantam plant manager loaded the documents into a car and drove them to the Quartermaster Corps Test Center at Camp Holabird on the edge of Baltimore. Probst had laid out the entire design in 2 days and finished the full bid package in 5. Nothing in it was original by itself. The engine came from a small company called Continental, a 4-cylinder unit producing about 45 horsepower. The transfer case came from Spicer. The transmission came from Warner Gear. The axles were modified Studebaker units. What was original was the way Probst had stitched these ordinary civilian parts together into something the Army had been asking for, and not getting, for 30 years, a small, 4-wheel drive, all-purpose vehicle that could be built fast, repaired anywhere, and shipped anywhere in the world. On the 23rd of September 1940, the finished prototype, known as the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, was driven from Butler, Pennsylvania, to Camp Holabird, Maryland, under its own power, roughly 250 miles, because Bantam could not afford to ship it. According to multiple Bantam accounts, it rolled through the camp gate about 30 minutes before the deadline. Then a strange and unfair thing happened. The Army tested the Bantam design, declared it the strongest candidate, and then, citing concerns that tiny Bantam could not produce vehicles in the quantities the war would require, handed Bantam's own blueprints to Willys and to Ford and ordered them to build vehicles of their own, based on the same layout. The government argued that the drawings, once submitted, belonged to it by contract. Karl Probst was furious. There was nothing he could do. Willys and Ford would go on to refine what Probst had drawn in 5 desperate days. They would strengthen it, re-engine it, and eventually build it by the hundreds of thousands. But the truck itself, the shape, the size, the entire idea of it, had already been decided in a half-empty drafting room in Butler, Pennsylvania, by a man the country would spend the rest of the century forgetting. None of that mattered yet in the autumn of 1940. What mattered was that for the first time in decades, the United States Army finally had a real answer to the mud of Plattsburgh, and it did not yet know how far that answer would travel. It did not know that this small, ugly truck would be dropped by glider behind enemy lines, driven through the surf at Normandy and Iwo Jima, gunned across the Egyptian desert by British commandos, and eventually stolen and repainted by the very army it was built to defeat. All of that was still ahead. In the fall of 1940, it was simply a truck that worked, arriving 30 minutes before a deadline nobody expected it to meet. Willys and Ford spent the rest of 1941 turning Probst's rough design into a war machine. Willys' engineering vice president Delmar Roos, known to everyone as Barney, had spent 2 years quietly modernizing an old 4-cylinder engine into a 60-horsepower unit the company called the Go Devil. Roos ran that engine flat out on a dynamometer for 100 hours straight, without a single failure, where the engine he had started with had broken down after only 22. The Go Devil was simply the best small military engine in the world, and the Army insisted that both Willys and Ford use it. Ford, in turn, contributed the now famous stamped steel grille with vertical slats that has been the visual signature of the Jeep ever since. By July of 1941, the Army had standardized everything. Willys built the vehicle as the Model MB. Ford built the same vehicle, with parts interchangeable down to the last bolt, as the GPW, the W standing for Willys, because Ford was now producing a Willys licensed design. Interchangeability was not a small detail. It meant a broken Ford Jeep in a muddy field in France could be repaired with a spare part stripped from a wrecked Willys Jeep 100 miles away, and a mechanic who had never seen either factory could still fix both. In 1948, the Federal Trade Commission would rule that the original design honors belonged to neither of them, but to American Bantam. At its peak, the Willys plant in Toledo was rolling a finished Jeep off the line roughly every 80 seconds, day and night, in a country that only 2 years earlier had not built a single one. By the time the war ended in 1945, Willys and Ford had built roughly 647,000 Jeeps between them. Willys made about 362,000. Ford made about 280,000. Bantam, the company that had invented the thing, built only about 2,675 before being shoved aside and survived the rest of the war by building roughly 74,000 quarter-ton trailers for the Jeeps to tow. Bantam never returned to making cars. It declared bankruptcy in 1950 and was absorbed by a steel company 6 years later. Karl Probst never grew rich from the design. He died in 1963, largely forgotten outside the small circle of Jeep enthusiasts and historians who knew exactly what he had done in that Pennsylvania drafting room. But the thing he had drawn, the strange little vehicle that 133 other companies had thought was impossible to build in 49 days, was about to do something nobody had quite anticipated. The first place it did so was a stretch of desert in eastern Egypt in the summer of 1942. The Special Air Service was, at that time, a small, semi-official, irregular British unit founded the previous year by a Scots Guards officer named David Stirling. Stirling was 26 years old. He had attended Trinity College, Cambridge, before being sent down, and had recently been recovering from injuries sustained in an experimental parachute jump that had nearly killed him. He had convinced skeptical superiors at Middle East headquarters in Cairo that small teams of trained men attacking German airfields by surprise could destroy more enemy aircraft on the ground than the Royal Air Force could destroy in the air. In the early months, the SAS had relied on heavy trucks to drive them near their targets, where the men would dismount, walk in on foot, and plant explosives. It worked, but it was slow, and as German security around the airfields tightened, it grew more dangerous with every raid. In the early summer of 1942, Stirling was given a small consignment of Jeeps, the very first to reach the SAS. The men who unloaded them from the transport trucks had never seen anything quite like them, a boxy little four-wheeled shape with none of the polish of a proper staff car, but Stirling looked at them and understood immediately what they were. They were not transport, they were a weapon system. He stripped them down, he cut off the windshields, he removed the bumpers, he bolted Vickers K aircraft machine guns to the front and rear of each vehicle, 4 guns per Jeep, fed by Pan magazines and capable of firing somewhere between 950 and 1,200 rounds a minute. He filled the back of each Jeep with jerry cans of fuel, water, ammunition, and explosive charges. On the night of the 26th of July, 1942, 18 modified Jeeps under Stirling's personal command crossed roughly 50 miles of open desert from a forward hideout on the edge of the Katara Depression to a German airfield called Sidi Hanesh, where the Luftwaffe was staging the transport aircraft that supplied Rommel's Afrika Korps. The men had spent the day hidden under camouflage netting in punishing heat, waiting for dark. The 18 Jeeps drove onto the field in 2 columns, in a V formation, headlights off, navigating by the stars. When Stirling fired a green flare, all 18 Jeeps opened fire at once, with more than 70 machine guns between them. They drove the length of the airfield, raking parked aircraft with tracer fire, while startled German ground crews scattered into the darkness. In about 15 minutes, they destroyed or damaged around 37 Axis aircraft, several of them loaded transports that had been due to fly fuel forward to Rommel's tanks within hours. They lost 1 man killed at the airfield itself and 1 Jeep disabled. The next morning, while withdrawing, German dive bombers caught part of the raiding force in the open and killed another man. The remaining Jeeps split into small groups and reached their hideout days later, running on fumes. The risk these men took went beyond ordinary combat danger. In October of 1942, Hitler issued his infamous commando order, directing that captured Allied commandos be shot immediately, rather than treated as prisoners of war. Sterling's men knew that if they were caught in these raids, the normal rules of warfare might not protect them. They drove into German airfields anyway, in an open jeep with no armor at all, because the jeep was fast enough and light enough to make the raid possible in the first place. In the 15 months between the night Sterling first put a Vickers gun on a jeep and the day he was captured by the Germans in Tunisia in January of 1943, the SAS destroyed more than 250 Axis aircraft on the ground in North Africa, alongside fuel dumps, supply depots, and miles of telephone line. It was a small unit, rarely numbering more than a few hundred men at any one time, and yet the damage it inflicted on Axis air power in the desert rivaled what entire squadrons of fighters had managed in the same stretch of the war. Sterling himself, captured while sleeping in a Tunisian wadi, became something of a German obsession, eventually ending up at Colditz Castle, where he remained until liberation. Popular accounts often credit Rommel personally with nicknaming him the Phantom Major, though more recent research suggests the nickname was more likely coined by British war correspondents. Either way, what the Germans were watching in the desert that summer was something they did not have a category for. Not because they lacked small vehicles of their own, and not because German engineers were incapable of excellent design. They had the Kübelwagen, the elegant Porsche-designed Volkswagen variant. But the Kübelwagen was not the Jeep. It had two-wheel drive. It had an air-cooled engine that, while reliable, produced only about 24 or 25 horsepower. It was an excellent passenger car adapted to military service. The Jeep was a military vehicle from the first sketch. It had four-wheel drive that could be engaged on the move. It could climb steep grades. It could ford about 18 inches of water without preparation, and substantially more with a deep-water fording kit. It could tow a trailer carrying nearly half its own weight. The Go Devil engine produced 60 horsepower and could run for days at full load without braking. It could be repaired by a soldier with a wrench, a hammer, and a basic mechanical understanding. When American engineers wrote, in that 1945 Intelligence Handbook, that the Volkswagen was inferior in nearly every way except seating comfort, they were not sneering. They were comparing two design philosophies. The German philosophy was to build a beautiful, finely engineered light vehicle. The American philosophy was to build a tool any soldier could use to do any job in any place without waiting for permission. A German motor pool officer inspecting a captured Jeep for the first time could see this philosophy laid bare simply by opening the hood. Where the Kübelwagen offered a neat, low-powered engine built for smooth roads and gentle grades, the Jeep offered a stubby, torquey engine bolted to a transfer case built to claw through anything. Where the Kübelwagen's body panels were shaped for aerodynamics and comfort, the Jeep's flat steel panels were shaped to be stamped quickly, welded quickly, and replaced quickly if a panel was torn off by a shell fragment. It was not a more advanced machine. In almost every technical sense, it was a cruder one, plain, unglamorous, and easy to mock at first glance. That was the entire point. That difference showed up everywhere else in the German army too. Germany entered the war in 1939 with an estimated 514,000 horses on its rolls. By the opening of the Soviet campaign in 1941, that number had grown to roughly 750,000. By February of 1945, with German factories collapsing under Allied bombing, the Wehrmacht was relying on an estimated 1.2 million horses, more than twice what it had used to invade Poland. The image most people carry of the German army, tanks thundering across European borders in a storm of mechanized fury, was true of only a small slice of the force at the front edge. Behind that edge, the bulk of the German army still marched on its own feet, with a horse pulling the wagon. The American Army of 1944 did not have that problem. The American Army of 1944 had jeeps. Consider what one jeep, in the hands of an ordinary soldier with no engineering training, could become. Welded brackets on the back turned it into a stretcher carrier, able to evacuate two wounded men under fire. A pair of pipes mounted on the front turned it into a wire cutter that could slice through German telephone lines strung along the Normandy hedgerows. Steel rails laid across the floor turned it into a maintenance vehicle that could travel on captured French railway lines. A pintle mount on the back seat turned it into a heavy machine gun platform. A canvas tarp and a simple frame turned it into a field ambulance. A heavy-duty winch on the front made it a recovery vehicle for stuck trucks. On the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, jeeps sank to their axles where heavier trucks could not even start moving. Yet the surviving jeeps still carried wounded Marines off the beaches in numbers the medical evacuation plans had not anticipated. On the Lido Road in the China-Burma-India theater, jeeps hauled medical supplies and ammunition up jungle trails the British had concluded were impossible in monsoon conditions. None of these modifications were designed in Detroit or Toledo. They were designed in the field by sergeants and corporals and privates with welding torches and salvaged parts, using the same kind of practical mechanical instinct that had once turned Henry Ford's Model T into 1,000 different farm tools across the American Midwest. A unit that needed a mobile radio platform bolted one to the back seat. A unit that needed to lay telephone wire quickly mounted a spool on the rear frame and let the Jeep unreel it while driving. Engineers even mounted small dozer blades on the front of a handful of Jeeps to clear debris and light obstacles from narrow village roads under fire, work that would otherwise have stopped an advancing column cold. No German quartermaster's manual anticipated any of it, because no German vehicle in that class was built with enough spare strength and simplicity to absorb this kind of constant, unauthorized reinvention. The most extreme of those modifications was the airborne Jeep, lightened and stripped to fit inside a glider for delivery behind enemy lines. Ground crews removed the windshield, the bumper ends, and any equipment not strictly required, then lashed the Jeep into the glider's deck with steel cables. A British glider regiment landed Jeeps this way at Arnhem in September of 1944, using them to tow anti-tank guns into the streets where the British 1st Airborne Division would make its desperate stand at the bridge. American Jeeps came in by glider with the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions across northern France, the Netherlands, and into Germany. In Operation Varsity, the airborne assault across the Rhine on the 24th of March, 1945, more than 200 Jeeps came in, with a single glider infantry regiment alone. Jeeps were never dropped by parachute in the Second World War. The technology to drop a vehicle that heavy under canopy did not yet exist. Their crews jumped by parachute. The Jeeps came in by glider, landing in fields still under fire, sometimes clipping trees or hedgerows on the way down, the fabric-skinned aircraft splintering around a vehicle that, more often than not, rolled out of the wreckage still running. The American war correspondent Ernie Pyle, who rode in Jeeps from North Africa to Italy to France until he was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on the island of Ieshima on the 18th of April 1945, wrote about the Jeep in a dispatch from North Africa in June of 1943. The line has been quoted by nearly every serious account since. And the Jeep, good Lord, I don't think we could continue the war without the Jeep. It does everything. It goes everywhere. It's as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat. It constantly carries twice what it was designed for, and still keeps on going. The medical role is worth pausing on because it is the role the men who served alongside the Jeep almost always remembered first. Trucks could not reach the forward foxholes. They were too wide for the narrow tracks cut through hedgerows and rubble, too heavy for bridges the engineers had not yet reinforced, too slow to turn around under fire. Jeeps could go where the trucks could not. They drove through artillery fire with red crosses painted on canvas tarps, picked up men who had been hit minutes before, and carried them back to the aid stations where surgeons could still save them. A driver might make that same run a dozen times in a single afternoon, each trip a gamble that the road ahead was still clear. The American died of wounds rate fell from roughly 8% in the First World War to roughly 4% in the Second. That improvement came from many things: sulfa drugs, plasma, penicillin, forward surgical hospitals. But forward casualty evacuation by jeep was a foundational part of the chain that kept those men alive, and it is the detail that veterans, decades later, still brought up first when asked what the jeep had meant to them. Now consider the other side of the line. In the autumn of 1944, as Hitler planned his last major offensive of the war in the Ardennes, he summoned a Waffen-SS lieutenant colonel named Otto Skorzeny to his headquarters in East Prussia. Skorzeny was a large man, well over 6 feet tall, with a dueling scar across his left cheek from his university days in Vienna. The date was the 22nd of October 1944. Skorzeny had received the propaganda credit a year earlier for the glider raid that freed Mussolini from a hotel atop the Gran Sasso, although the operation had actually been planned and led by a Luftwaffe paratroop officer. Hitler now had a more delicate task for him. He wanted Skorzeny to assemble a brigade of English-speaking German soldiers, dress them in American uniforms, equip them with American vehicles, and send them through American lines in the opening hours of the Ardennes attack, to seize bridges, cut telephone lines, and create paralytic confusion behind the front. The cover name was Operation Grief, German for Griffin. Skorzeny submitted his shopping list to the German High Command. He requested 15 captured tanks of any kind, 20 armored cars, 20 self-propelled guns, about 100 American jeeps, 40 motorcycles, and 120 trucks. He was promised 20 Sherman tanks. He received about 2, only one of which was running. He received a handful of scout cars, roughly 30 jeeps, and about 15 trucks. The rest he had to make up by painting German vehicles olive drab and stenciling white stars on them. Of about 2,500 volunteers screened for fluent American English, Skorzeny found perhaps 10 who spoke it with true idiom. Another 30 or 40 spoke good English without the slang, and the rest were marginal at best. But it is what Skorzeny did with the jeeps he had that matters most. He did not use the German Kubelwagens his own army was producing by the tens of thousands. He used the captured American jeeps, because he and his men understood exactly what the Americans understood. The jeep would go where their own vehicles could not, and any American military policeman at a checkpoint would wave it through without a second thought. The operation was a tactical failure but a psychological success of staggering proportions. American sentries across the Ardennes front began stopping every jeep they did not recognize and demanding answers to baseball trivia, state capitals, and the names of cartoon characters. General Omar Bradley was briefly detained when a suspicious military policeman doubted his correct answer about the capital of Illinois. General Eisenhower, warned that Skorzeny's commandos might be trying to assassinate him, was effectively confined to his Versailles headquarters for several days over Christmas of 1944. A handful of German commandos in stolen jeeps came closer to paralyzing the Allied chain of command than entire German divisions did in the same offensive. Roughly 18 of Skorzeny's commandos were captured wearing American uniforms and executed under the laws of war governing spies. The first 3 were tried near Henri-Chapelle in Belgium on the 21st of December 1944 and shot by an American firing squad 2 days later, on the 23rd, standing in front of a stone wall with American guards on either side. Most of the remaining executions followed within days, in small groups at the same site. Skorzeny himself survived the war, surrendered in May of 1945, and was tried before an American military tribunal in 1947 on charges of improperly using American uniforms in combat. He and his co-defendants were acquitted, in part on testimony that Allied special forces had themselves contemplated wearing enemy uniforms during the war. Skorzeny lived another 28 years. The captured American jeep, his commando's principal infiltration vehicle, had been the operational center of the most ambitious mission of his career, and it had done more to shake the Allied High Command in a single week than any tank he ever commanded. By the winter of 1944, both sides of the war had rendered their verdict on the jeep in the clearest way soldiers know how. The Americans built it by the hundreds of thousands and gave it to every unit that asked. The Germans, who could not build enough of anything by 1944, stole it wherever they found it, repainted it, and used it to try to win their last great gamble of the war. What remained in the quiet months after the guns finally fell silent was the question of what the men who had commanded both sides would say about it once the shooting stopped for good. Beginning in 1945, the United States Army Historical Division undertook a project no other army had attempted on quite this scale. American officers gathered the surviving senior officers of the German Army, men who only months before had commanded corps and armies, and asked them to write down, in detail, what they had actually thought in real time about the war they had just lost. Much of the work was carried out at facilities in the German towns of Allendorf and Neustadt, with the former chief of the German General Staff, Franz Halder, helping to organize the effort from the German side. The program, known as the Foreign Military Studies Series, eventually produced roughly 2,500 manuscripts, most of which now sit in the National Archives at College Park, Maryland. It remains the largest single body of senior German military analysis of the war that exists anywhere in the world. The interviews themselves were an uneasy exercise for everyone involved. German generals who had commanded entire army groups a few months earlier now sat across a table from American colonels, writing careful, technical prose about a war they had lost, knowing their words would be filed away and studied by the very army that had defeated them. Some were candid, some were defensive. Almost all of them, when pressed, circled back to the same handful of themes, and one of them, again and again, was mobility. In those manuscripts, German generals were asked about Allied air power, Allied artillery, the Sherman tank, and the broader question of why their armies had lost. They blamed Hitler, they blamed the weather, they blamed the Russians. They rarely named the Jeep directly in their formal reports, and it would have been unusual for a general to devote a paragraph to a truck when he could write instead about grand strategy or the failures of high command. But they did not have to name it directly. They named its consequences instead. The speed at which American units could shift weight from one sector of the front to another, sometimes overnight, faster than German intelligence could update its own maps. The depth to which American reconnaissance could probe their lines before being detected, patrols that seemed to appear from nowhere and vanish just as quickly. The rate at which American casualties were evacuated, treated, and in many cases returned to combat within weeks, keeping units at a strength German commanders could not match. The constant, grinding pressure American forward units could maintain on a battered German line, because supply never stopped reaching them, day or night, in mud or snow, in a way that German supply, tied to rail lines and horse-drawn wagons, simply could not sustain in the war's final year. Every one of those advantages, on the ground, came down to the small four-wheel drive truck that moved everything an American battalion needed at a speed no German equivalent could match. In an American infantry battalion, communication wire could be laid, casualties could be evacuated, reconnaissance could be conducted, and forward positions could be resupplied, all at the same time, because each task was being carried out by a separate jeep moving on a separate road. A German battalion attempting the same set of tasks in late 1944 often had to perform them one after another, frequently on foot or with a horse-drawn cart, because it simply did not have enough motor vehicles to spare. The contrast came down to two different philosophies, expressed in steel. The Germans had built the Kubelwagen as a finished object, a clever, comfortable, finely tuned design that did one thing very well, carrying a small number of officers across reasonable terrain. They built roughly 50,000 of them across the entire war. The Americans had built the Jeep as an unfinished object, a simple, repairable, endlessly modifiable platform that did one thing, get from here to there with anything a soldier wanted to put on it, anywhere on Earth. They built roughly 647,000 of them. Around 50,000 Jeeps were sent to the Soviet Union under Lend-Lease, where Russian troops nicknamed them Villas and used them as command vehicles for officers all the way to the outskirts of Berlin. The German answer to mobility was a refined design, produced in modest numbers by a small circle of specialists. The American answer was a rough design, produced in overwhelming numbers, and finished in the field by the men who used it every day. The first answer is the answer of a culture that trusts its engineers completely, that assumes the smartest solution comes from the top and should not be tampered with once handed down. The second is the answer of a culture that trusts everybody with a wrench, that assumes the man doing the job usually knows something the man who designed it does not, and builds room for that knowledge into the machine itself. Neither philosophy was foolish. Germany's finest engineers produced some of the most advanced tanks and aircraft of the war under exactly the same institutional logic. But mobility, it turned out, rewarded the second philosophy far more than the first, because a war fought across an entire continent needed millions of small decisions made quickly and locally, not thousands of perfect ones made slowly and centrally. The men who made this possible mostly did not live to see how the story would be told. Karl Probst and the American Bantam Car Company, the two forces behind the original design, had already faded into obscurity by the time the war ended, remembered mainly by a small circle of Jeep enthusiasts and historians rather than by the country they had equipped. David Stirling, who bolted machine guns to a Jeep in the Egyptian desert and helped invent modern special operations in the process, spent much of the rest of the war as a prisoner, finally liberated from Colditz Castle in 1945, and lived to see the regiment he had founded become a permanent part of the British Army. Ernie Pyle did not live to see any of it. The man who had loved the Jeep more than any other piece of equipment in the United States Army, and said so in print for millions of readers, was already gone by the time the last of these vehicles rolled off the assembly line. Most of the original 647,000 Jeeps built during the war are gone now, scrapped, rusted away, or broken down for parts decades ago. Some were simply left behind on the beaches and airfields where they finally broke, too worn out to be worth shipping home. The ones that survive are collector's items today, restored by hobbyists down to the last olive drab stencil, sold at auction for tens of thousands of dollars to buyers whose grandfathers might have driven similar ones ashore at Salerno or Cherbourg or Manila Bay, and never spoke much about it afterward, the way so many of that generation simply put the war behind them and went back to work. The Wehrmacht's own behavior on the battlefield said something its official reports never quite put into plain language: capturing the Jeep, repainting it with German crosses, building Skorzenny's most ambitious commando operation of the war around a captured handful of them, rather than trusting the vehicles their own factories were producing. By the end, they were trying very hard to become the very army they had spent years fighting. In 1948, Dwight Eisenhower published his memoir of the war in Europe, called Crusade in Europe. Buried in the middle of that book is a sentence that has been quoted by nearly every serious historian of American mechanization since. 4 other pieces of equipment that most senior officers came to regard as among the most vital to our success in Africa and Europe were the bulldozer, the Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 airplane. Curiously enough, none of these is designed for combat. That sentence is the one worth sitting with. The most consequential American equipment of the Second World War, by the judgment of the man who commanded the entire Allied effort in Europe, was not the equipment that fired the bullets. It was the equipment that put the men carrying the bullets exactly where they needed to be, exactly when they needed to be there. The Jeep never won a battle by itself. What it did was let every other American weapon win its battle on time. Every artillery piece, every machine gun, every radio, every wounded soldier, every officer with an order to deliver, every reel of telephone wire, every can of fuel, all of it moved, at some point, on the back of a small, homely 4-wheel drive truck that a freelance engineer had sketched out in a matter of days in a half-empty drafting room in Butler, Pennsylvania, because a nearly bankrupt company had one phone number left to call. The men who built the Jeep, who drove it, and who bled in the back of it while a friend held pressure on a wound, are mostly gone now. If you have a relative who served anywhere in the Second World War, in any branch, on any front, who might have ridden in one of these trucks across a desert, a beachhead, or a French hedgerow, their name and their story deserve to be remembered, not filed away in a box of old photographs nobody opens anymore. The vehicle these men built, scattered now in museums and driveways and private collections across the world, is the closest thing many of them ever got to a monument. It carries no plaque and tells no medals of its own, but sitting quietly under a tarp in a barn or rolling once a year in a small-town parade, it is, in its own stubborn way, still telling the same story the German generals could never quite bring themselves to say out loud in their own memoirs, that in the end, against every tank and every fortress they had built, they had lost, in no small part, to a truck.